Your lecturer is Dr. Peter M. Vishton. Dr. Vishton is Associate Professor of Psychology at the College of William and Mary. He received his BA in Psychology and Computer Science from Swarthmore College and his PhD in Psychology and Cognitive Science from Cornell University. Dr. Vishton's research explores human cognition, development, and action both in infants and adults. Specifically, he investigates visually guided action, visual perception, and how sensory systems alter themselves during familiar tasks, such as reaching. His studies have been supported by the National Institute of Child Health and Development and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Vishton has served as Program Director for Developmental and Learning Sciences at the National Science Foundation. He has been published in the top journals in the field of psychology, including Science, Psychological Science, the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology, and Experimental Brain Research.
One of the first things many people notice when they become a new parent is just how many different sources of advice are suddenly available. Relatives, neighbors, and friends all have advice. And there are literally thousands of websites and published books out there to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. We played Chutes and Ladders with our daughter, and it really helped her improve her math grades when she got to first grade. You need to make sure your kids taste a little of their vegetables so they can learn about them. But you're asking for trouble if you make them clean their plates before they can leave the table. Sometimes the advice can even be contradictory. If you let your son play too many video games, he'll be at risk for obesity. My son played a video game that taught him a lot about reading, and he seems just fine. Now, if you're having a particular parenting challenge, advice can be a good thing. You can get ideas from other people who've gone through the same experiences. You can try out their suggestions and maybe solve your problem, whatever it is. On the other hand, a lot of advice doesn't work. And even if the problem does go away, you can't ever really know just what was responsible for fixing it. What we really need to address issues like these is science. Science provides a set of tools for answering questions about what works and doesn't work. Science can, in many cases, even tell us how something works, so that we can know what to try next if a particular parenting hint doesn't seem to have the desired effect. This course is about this type of parenting advice, not just stories, anecdotes, and people telling you how they approached parenting, but tips and ideas that have been supported by careful, systematic, scientific research. For instance, the tips that I started with today about chutes and ladders, video games, and vegetables, those have all been supported by careful research. And I'll tell you the details of it in future lectures. In every lecture, I'll tell you about advice or tips that have been supported by scientific studies of child development and parenting. Along the way, I'll be telling you a lot about theories of child development and the psychology of human interaction as well. But we'll always include specific, practical advice that's been backed up by careful research. Fortunately, there are a lot of fun things you can do that turn out to be really good for your kids. There's a lot of information that's come out of research on child development that's just plain interesting and useful to parents. So without further ado, let's dive into our first tip. Give your child supervised tummy time. Prior to the 1990s, almost all babies were put to sleep at night on their bellies. Since then, however, most parents in the US have switched to putting their babies to sleep on their backs, and with good reason. Sleeping on the stomach has been related to accidental suffocation and sudden infant death syndrome, often called SIDS. This is a tragic situation in which the child can suffocate if the nose and mouth are blocked by soft bedding. If the baby sleeps on her back, the likelihood of this is significantly reduced, and that's a really good thing. As we've switched to back sleeping, however, there have been a few interesting developmental consequences. One of the biggest is that crawling starts significantly later than it used to. Any list of infant developmental milestones will describe crawling as something that happens around 6 months of age for most children. Several studies, published in the late 1990s, based on surveys and observations of hundreds of infants in the United States and England, found that the average has moved up substantially. Some researchers have started to describe many modern infants as bucket babies because they spend so much of their time in restrained positions in car seats. Now, the first thing to note is that missing that 6-month milestone is not the end of the world. Those same studies that reported the delay in the onset of crawling, for instance, found that the babies caught up to regular gross motor milestones by about 18 months of age. In some nomadic societies, infants are swaddled and otherwise restrained until as late as 1 year of age for most of the day. When the children are introduced to free movement, they're understandably rather uncoordinated. But within a few months, they're just as good at walking and even running as their same-age peers who weren't swaddled and restrained. That said, there are a number of important mental developments that accompany the onset of self-controlled locomotion. If you're looking to enrich the experiences of a young child in a very natural way, helping her to learn to crawl is a good choice. And it's pretty easy to do. All you need to do is spend a few minutes each day on the activity commonly referred to as tummy time. If you gently place your 3 or 4-month-old on some soft surface, like a clean carpet, she may initially not react very positively. Young infants' neck muscles are quite weak relative to the weight of their heads, so the baby will have to strain just to hold her head up. She won't be able to see much. Many babies begin to fuss and cry almost immediately when they're left on their stomachs for the first time. Gently lift the baby, soothe her, and then try again. If you repeat this several times, you'll gradually be able to increase the amount of time that the baby spends on the stomach until she can start to explore this novel posture. If you get down on the floor with the baby, even put your head right down there next to her, that will typically help. What you'll see at first won't look like much, mostly just uncoordinated wriggling and flailing. But that movement in this posture will stretch and work the baby's muscles in novel ways. If you do this for about 15 minutes a day, the baby will get stronger and more capable. Within a few weeks, she'll start to be able to look around and even make some forward progress with that wriggling movement. Around 6 months, self-produced locomotion will emerge. And then the real excitement begins, as the child can begin to explore the world independently for the very first time. Now, each child is different, of course. Some kids will crawl earlier than others, even if they grow up in exactly the same environment. There are big cultural differences as well. I've already mentioned children in nomadic cultures who are swaddled almost all day, and thus prevented from moving around much at all. They tend to crawl much later in life. Some groups have been studied in China who leave their infants on very soft surfaces for most of the day, which makes it more difficult for them to move around independently. These infants exhibit what appears to be a motor delay, crawling and walking later. Other cultures go in the other direction. Among some Kenyan groups, infants are vigorously exercised. They're stretched when they bathe each day. The moms stretch and manipulate the baby's arms, legs, and torso. The babies are also propped into a sitting position and allowed to balance there independently. They fall over a lot at first, but they get better at sitting quickly. All of this activity seems to promote earlier onset of several motor milestones, for instance, sitting independently, crawling, and even walking. There's also a lot of variation within cultures, just across individual kids. Researchers in this area used to think of motor development as an unfolding of brain and body maturation, maybe with a bit of trial and error practice thrown in for good measure. The idea is that all children follow roughly the same pattern of development. Timing of the milestones was the only real variability that was considered. Modern researchers, however, have come to think of motor development as like a long series of problem-solving tasks that children face. Since children have similar bodies and brains, most of them tend to come up with the same basic solutions. But every once in a while, some kids get very creative. As a graduate student, I got to know one baby who never crawled, not because she had a developmental problem at all. She never crawled because she never had to. She came up with a better way to get around, rolling. She would play with the toys in the waiting room of our lab. We would hand her something, but like most kids, she would eventually be ready to play with something else. When she was, you could see her pick out her next target and line herself up. And she would pull in her arms and just roll across the room until she got to the toy. She'd pull herself back up with a big smile and just go on playing. According to her parents, she went straight from this rolling behavior to walking. Apparently, the old saying isn't always true. Sometimes you don't need to learn to crawl before you can walk. Regardless of the method, as these developments in self-produced locomotion ability take place, there's evidence that corresponding mental developments are tied to them. Consider the following experiment with a 3-month-old. The baby sits in a comfortable seat and hears an auditory cue. Hey baby, here comes the puppet. About 5 seconds later, a puppet appears 45 degrees to the right of the baby. The baby looks at the puppet. If you repeat this process about a half dozen times, the infant will start to look for the puppet before it appears. The baby will hear that auditory cue, here comes the puppet, and look 45 degrees to the right. The baby at this point has encoded and remembered the spatial location of where the puppet comes from. Okay, next you rotate the infants 90 degrees to the right. Then you repeat the procedure. Hey baby, here comes the puppet. Now if you, as an adult, were in this situation, you would turn to the left now, since you rotated to the right to look at where the puppet was. Now the puppet is to your left, right? If the child is very young, however, and not yet crawling, she will tend to look 45 degrees further to the right, just as she'd been doing all along. A pre-crawling infant encodes the locations of objects. She can do that, but she encodes them relative to her own body in an egocentric fashion. Only older, crawling infants seem to encode locations in an allocentric or world-centered framework. Motor development and cognitive development thus seem to go hand in hand through infancy. While those cross-cultural studies show us that there's no right age at which a child should start crawling, supervised tummy time can give your child an opportunity to get stronger, both physically and mentally. And as the baby becomes more mobile, tummy time can give way to cruising. This is when the baby starts to stand while holding on to help balance and begins to toddle around while holding on to things like furniture and other objects. If you want, you can set up a small cruising course in your living room. Line up the furniture so that there are easy places for the baby to hang on, and your cruising child can walk around the living room freely. Cruising kids, I should say, frequently fall, so you'll also want to move any sharp, hard things out of the way here. And of course, you should always be safe and monitor this activity closely. And toddlers, children's ages about 1 to 3 years, benefit from 60 to 90 minutes of activity and movement every day, even more. At each stage, parents can help by interacting with the child, building trust and allowing the child time to freely explore, while a parent supervises, of course. Jumpers and exercisers, those can be great, but exploring the world is important as well. This connection between physical and mental development continues as the child grows older, which brings us to a tip for older children. Get your kids involved in a disciplined form of physical activity, such as traditional Taekwondo. There have been a number of studies here, but one of the best was published in 2004 by Kimberly Lakes at the University of California at Irvine. A group of over 200 children between kindergarten and 5th grade were randomly assigned to either a Taekwondo group or a standard physical education group. In the Midwestern elementary school in which the study was conducted, the children all attended physical education classes 4 times per week for about 45 minutes a day. For the children who were randomly assigned to that Taekwondo group, 2 or 3 of those standard physical education sessions were replaced with Taekwondo instructional sessions. The study took place for about 3 months. At the end of the 3-month intervention phase, the standard and Taekwondo groups were tested using a whole bunch of different psychological assessments. The Taekwondo group did better on a wide range of these different tests. They were better in terms of their ability to remain focused on a task and resist distraction. They were better at regulating their own emotions. They were better in terms of sharing, cooperation, and other related pro-social behaviors. Teachers' reports about the children, and I should note that the teachers were not told which children were in which one of these 2 groups. Those teacher reports suggested that the Taekwondo kids behaved better in their classrooms during the rest of the day. The Taekwondo kids even performed significantly better on a standardized math test. The first question that one should have in mind at this point is why? Why on earth would learning to kick, punch, break boards, and shout have anything to do with performing better on a math test? Or any of these other assessments that the researchers used for that matter? Why should learning to perform a set of prescribed movements or sparring have anything to do with cooperating and sharing better? To give the full developmental science answer to this, I need to take a few steps back and talk about marshmallows. In the 1970s, a developmental scientist named Walter Mischel began performing a seemingly simple test of children's self-control. He or a research assistant would lead a young child into a plain room with a table and a few chairs. On the table, the researcher would place a marshmallow. The children in these initial studies were between 3 and 7 years of age. Now, if you spend any time around kids in this age group, you know they love marshmallows. Candy in general is a powerful draw for kids at this age. Mischel or his assistants would make a deal with the child at this point. Now, Jane, if you leave this marshmallow here and don't eat it until I come back, then you can eat this marshmallow and a second one that I'll bring with me. But if you eat this marshmallow before I come back, then you only get this one. In essence, Mischel wanted to see if these young children were capable of engaging in one of the most basic processes of rational economics, delay of gratification. If the child can resist the immediate, smaller reward of a single marshmallow, then they'll get a delayed but larger reward of 2 marshmallows. This principle describes a really wide range of the things that humans do, actually. When we work, in many cases, it's not because we're intrinsically excited by the thing that we're doing, although it's great when we are. In many cases, people work because they get paid as a result of working. That is, we resist the immediate reward of doing the thing that we might want to do, sleeping in, playing games, going to the movies, whatever, in order to get the larger but delayed reward of a paycheck. Adults engage in delayed gratification all the time, but can kids? Mischel and many others found that 7-year-olds are really good at resisting the marshmallow. Mischel typically waited about 15 minutes before we'd come back with that second marshmallow. Almost all the 7-year-olds in his study stuck it out for the bigger payoff. The 3-year-olds in Mischel's studies, they didn't do as well. They typically only made it a few seconds. In some cases, they put that first marshmallow in their mouths before the experimenter even managed to leave the room. The really interesting kids to watch were the 5-year-olds. If you go to YouTube or a similar internet video library and search for the terms marshmallow test, you'll get a lot of very entertaining hits. Some of the 5-year-olds in Mischel's initial study didn't last very long at all. Within a few seconds, they ate that first marshmallow. Other 5-year-olds, though, lasted much longer. The most entertaining of the videos that you can watch are these 5-year-olds with the high levels of self-control. It's not that they didn't want the marshmallow. In many cases, they clearly did. While they resisted eating it, you could plainly see the battle they were fighting with themselves. They'd talk to themselves, they would sing, they'd look away from the marshmallow, they'd climb under the table, they'd pet the marshmallow like a dog sometimes. They'd do anything they could think of to distract themselves for just a few more seconds in the hope that that researcher would return with that precious second marshmallow. The kids who are best at resisting the marshmallow are the ones who are the best at coming up with creative strategies for distracting themselves from the impulse to eat that marshmallow. They're the kids who are the best able to maintain control over themselves and their impulses. This is interesting from a developmental science perspective. There's something fascinating here that's happening between the ages of 3 and 7 years in terms of self-control, and we can watch it happen. In fact, you can try the marshmallow test with your own children in your own home, anytime you want. It doesn't even have to be a marshmallow test. It could be a cookie test or an orange slice test. As long as it's something that the child really wants, asking them to resist consuming it for a few minutes will engage and test the child's self-control. Mischel often used a one-way mirror and a video camera to capture the behaviors of the kids in his tests. You can just peek from a secluded location if you'd like. If you do have a video camera, though, it's worth going to the trouble of setting it up here. It's key that the child have a clear understanding that you're not present. It's just the kid and the marshmallow and all that time to resist. So this is interesting and fun, I think, but there's more. About 10 years after that original marshmallow study, Mischel and his colleagues happened to look back in on those kids in the initial study. They were teenagers by then, much older, much more sophisticated. By a decade later, they barely resembled the 5-year-old kids that had visited Michel's lab at Stanford University. Michel and his colleagues studied these teenagers with a variety of surveys, given both to them and to their teachers. They also obtained access to records of those students' grades. What Michel found was unexpected and kind of amazing. The kids who, as 5-year-olds, managed to wait longer before eating that first marshmallow tended to be generally more competent teenagers than their peers who ate the marshmallow after only a relatively short delay. The kids who exhibited poor self-control as 5-year-olds tended to have fewer friends and more behavioral problems in high school. The kids with good self-control as 5-year-olds were significantly less prone to depression. Later studies have shown that the kids who resisted eating the marshmallow longer tended to get better grades in school and to earn significantly larger salaries as adults. The kids who ate that first marshmallow most quickly were even more likely to end up in trouble with the police. All of this from a little game with a marshmallow. This is where we come back to our study, in which the kids were doing traditional Taekwondo. We showed that doing that Taekwondo improved their behavior and even their math performance. It's not the punching, yelling, and kicking that matters, per se. It's the emphasis that those classes provide on self-regulation. The Taekwondo instructors in that study always instructed the children to ask themselves several key questions as they prepared to begin their class. Where am I? What am I doing? And what should I be doing? The first two questions are about getting the children to focus on themselves and their surroundings, to engage in self-monitoring. The third question is about getting the children to engage in intentional, self-controlled behavior, to focus on how they could change their behavior to shift from what they're doing to what they intend to do. Throughout the class, these concepts of self-monitoring and self-regulation were reinforced and practiced over and over. And when children practice things, they get better at them. It should be noted that not all martial arts classes, or even all Taekwondo classes, have this focus on self-monitoring and self-regulation. Many do, but not all. Kimberly Lakes and her colleagues recommend traditional Taekwondo for this reason. The concepts of self-discipline and only using the techniques for self-defense, for instance, are central to this approach. Incidentally, what's called traditional Taekwondo was developed in Korea only in the 1940s from older traditions, including karate and judo. Any of these martial arts might be appropriate, again, if taught with an emphasis on self-regulation. A part of martial arts training that also seems potentially relevant is sparring. When a student practices, with the benefit of protective equipment, of course, trying to kick and punch another student. At the same time, of course, the key is to dodge and block the kicks and punches of the sparring partner. This task involves being very aware of the position, not only of the self, but of the opponent. Knowing just when you are balanced, but your opponent is not, is a physically and mentally challenging task. Given the intense engagement of the mind in this situation, it's quite sensible that regular practice might lead to improved concentration, awareness, even performance on a math test. Lakes and her colleagues also found that the magnitude of the benefits were not the same for all of the children in the study. For instance, the effects were largest for 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. Perhaps the children younger than this, for them, the techniques were not the right ones to use. Or maybe younger kids need more time to learn the techniques and see the benefits in other areas of life. The study only lasted for 3 months. Maybe that just wasn't long enough. Or perhaps the development of self-control in children in kindergarten and 1st grade, it's just not far enough along to benefit as much from practice. The effects were there for those younger kids. There were still significant positive benefits. They were just smaller. The benefits were also significantly larger for boys than for girls. It's not clear exactly why that is. As with the age group differences, there are several possibilities. Perhaps the boys were just generally more excited by this approach, for instance, and thus more engaged. Another very viable alternative is that the boys had more to gain. That is, perhaps the boys in general were more lacking in self-control than the girls in the study. If that's true, then they had more room for improvement, which could explain the greater gains. Some studies have suggested that interventions like this in general are more effective for kids who have some pre-existing deficits in the area. Some studies with juvenile delinquents, for instance, show really enormous effects of practice in self-monitoring and self-regulation. I should mention that traditional Taekwondo isn't the only activity that's been found to enhance mental function in this fashion, in general, or even self-control and executive function. As you can infer from this consideration of the Taekwondo study, it's not actually the kicking and punching that has the effect, it's the mental control practice that goes with it. It's not surprising then that you can achieve similar benefits from other mentally and physically engaging tasks. Yoga isn't something that most people associate with young children, but some schools have included regular yoga as an option. When some students are randomly assigned to a yoga program and compared with students who engage in other standard physical fitness activities, there are related improvements in memory and executive function. Yoga practice involves focusing on breathing while engaging in challenging stretching and movement tasks. It's almost as if the people who developed yoga knew something about executive function and child development. And if you can't access activities like Taekwondo or yoga, you might look into dance classes, or maybe a deliberate approach to arts and crafts. Horseback riding, where you pay attention to the horse just as much as to yourself, might be another great option. There aren't studies for every one of these activities you might consider, but any way for children to experience new movement challenges while also practicing a greater degree of self-control seems likely to produce many of these same benefits. As I conclude today, I want to mention some principles of science that you should have in mind, both while watching this course and as you consider other information that you encounter in the future. Anytime someone presents you with evidence for a claim like, doing X will enhance your child's mental function, you should look carefully at the evidence he or she presents. Did they conduct a careful study with lots of kids? How did they recruit those kids? How did they measure the effects of X, whatever that is? Most of all, you should look to see if randomization was used. That is, did every child recruited for that study have an equal chance of being in the experimental condition or the control condition? Without randomization, then any result may still be suggestive of an effect, but it's merely suggestive. There may have been biases in how children were placed in the two groups that could provide an alternative explanation. In the case of Taekwondo and yoga, that proper randomization has been used in several studies, and the effects hold up. It really seems that participating in activities like this improves kids' general mental performance, even relatively far outside the domain in which they practice these activities, even in a math test. Over the course of the next 23 lectures, I plan to describe many results like this. Each lecture will contain several tips for which there's good scientific support. It may sometimes seem that a tip is obvious. Pretty much everyone knows that it's important for kids to eat vegetables. Why should a lecture have to tell them that? Everyone knows it's good for kids to be in small classes. Why present scientific studies on the topic? The issue comes up with many studies in the domain of psychological science, actually. People feel like they knew what the results of the experiments would be even before the study result is reported. But there are at least two relevant facts to cite here. First, it turns out that most questions seem easy once you know the answers. When researchers have given people study descriptions, however, and asked them to guess what the result would be, they aren't nearly as good at predicting as they feel like they would be. In many cases, they're conflicting stories that fit any potential result. Is it good to force kids to eat their vegetables? Well, if the answer is yes, then you can recall the time that your mother made you eat all of your peas before you could leave the table. If the answer is no, then you can think about the pitfalls of stress and anxiety that go with pushing kids too hard. What matters, however, is the result of the actual study. That's what this course is about. We'll talk about the experiments that have been performed, how they were done, what the results were, and what that suggests about how we should deal with our children. A second reason to talk about the studies has to do with the subtleties that come out of good research on parenting and child development. Are video games good or bad for children? Well, it depends. How old is the child? What type of video game is it? How long will the child play that video game each day? What aspects of their behavior and development should we measure to count as being good or bad? Only when we start to consider the research do detailed questions like this come up. And when we talk about the experiments, detailed answers sometimes emerge too. I've been around developmental science for a long time now, as a researcher, professor, as a program officer for the National Science Foundation. There's been a real explosion of studies that are very relevant and valuable to parents over the past several decades. This course is a set of stories about those very studies. In addition, I'm a parent of 2 children. Being a parent is one of the central aspects of my life and has been for over a decade now. I talk to lots of parents, both in my role as a father and as someone who studies child development. When you study infants, you get to talk with the parents who bring them for visits to the lab. Parents always have some stories, and I'll share them along with some of my own. But my goal here is to tell you about what is and is not supported by scientific work on parenting and child development. If something seems like a good idea, but there isn't any good data on it, then I'll likely not mention it in this course. I'll mention a few of these things, but I'll always make a point of noting that it's not based on extensive study and give my reasons for considering it noteworthy. Let me also explain one more thing that this course is not. This course is not an instruction guide about how to make your child a superstar genius who will go to Harvard University, cure cancer, and sit on the Supreme Court. It's not about how to supercharge your child's development to give him or her some enormous advantage over his or her peers. One of the things that I'll discuss here are some ways that interventions aimed merely at supercharging child development have actually backfired. Children have been developing a lot longer than scientists have been studying them. Most of the best and most important parts of child development can happen quite well if we parents provide a good environment and then just stay out of the way. As we wrap up this time, remember the value of getting your kids involved in activities that promote self-awareness and self-control. This starts with tummy time for infants and stretches to Taekwondo for kids in elementary school. These effects are potentially very large for kids who seem to have difficulty with concentration and self-regulation. Also keep in mind, as children get older, there are many activities that are potentially as effective as traditional Taekwondo. For instance, yoga, even some specifically developed computer games I'll discuss later. Next time, we're going to wind the clock all the way back to 0 and talk about newborn infants. I'll consider what seemingly helpless babies are thinking and how we should strive as parents to relate to them. I hope you'll join me.